Hello everyone, this is Alex Cordobard, and I have not made a tutorial in a while, so I've decided to put one tutorial every week. So if you have any requests or need any help with anything, just let me know and I'll do my best to help. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at how to sculpt in Blender. So we're going to be looking at the different methods of sculpting and the different tools used in sculpting. So let's get started. Sculpting has a lot more freedom than modeling because in modeling you have to worry about all the vertices and faces and the flow of those vertices and faces and where they're positioned and everything else so that you have good animation and it's easy to texture your model, etc. So sculpting, you just have to worry about the form of your model, whereas modeling you have to worry about everything else, which is much more mathematical, and sculpting is much more artistic. So to go into sculpt mode, all we have to do is select the cube by right-clicking it, go down here where it says object mode, and select sculpt mode. To the left right here, there's the properties panel, or the options for your sculpting. If you do not see it, just hit T, and it will bring it up. Now if I click this image, it will give me a lot of different brushes to use within sculpting. If I select the default one, which is brush, and go over here to the corner of the cube and left click and drag, you can see that it starts to bring that corner out. Now the problem right now is that we cannot really sculpt anything because, as you can see with our cube, it's very limited in the amount of vertices that it has. So we can't create any forms really. So what we need to do is go over here to the modifiers tab, which is this wrench icon right here. Click add modifier, and we're going to add a multi-resolution modifier. Now what this does is basically it subdivides your mesh so that it adds a lot more vertices to it so that you're able to create the forms that you want. So let's go ahead and click subdivide, and immediately you can see what it's done. And there's a lot more vertices to play around with. But this isn't enough, so let's go ahead and subdivide it up to level 4. Now if I go over here with my brush and start drawing on it, you can see that it's pulling out the vertices and we start to get some different forms. Now the way you would use the multi-resolution modifier is you would start at the lowest level possible, such as 4, or if you have a more complex mesh than a cube, it might be lower, such as 2 or 3. And you would go to the lowest level possible where you can start adding some detail, and you would start adding the bigger detail to the mesh. Then once you've added the big detail, you would hit subdivide again, and if I go into wireframe you will see what happens. If I hit subdivide, you will see that all the faces have been subdivided into 4 more faces so that we have a lot more vertices to play with. And once you have subdivided it, you would go in and add smaller detail. And once you've added that detail, you would add even smaller detail. And you could also, right here, if on the sculpt level, which is 6, you could also go back down to previous levels to sculpt on a lower resolution mesh. Now the problem with multi-resolution is, for example, if I want my object to have this amount of detail here, like something that doesn't need that much detail and it doesn't need that many vertices or anything, but over here I want something that has very fine detail, such as folds in the skin or creases in the skin. The problem with this is that to get that amount of detail, I would need a lot more vertices right here. But I wouldn't want to add more vertices here because I don't need it, because this form is good for me. I wouldn't need more vertices because it's of no use. But the problem with this is that if I click subdivide to add more detail here to be able to make creases, now it's subdivided this area right here, which I don't need to subdivide it, and you can see that it's added a lot more vertices, which are completely useless because I'm not going to be adding finer detail here. So that's one of the downsides with multi-resolution, is that you can't really control exactly where you have more vertices or less vertices. It just basically distributes all the vertices and subdivisions along the whole mesh. So this is kind of bad because sometimes you will have a very, very dense mesh and you only need it to be dense on one side of it. And it makes Blender go slower, it could crash, it makes it harder to sculpt. So a new way of sculpting, if I delete this modifier and go over here to the tools and click on topology and select enable dynamic. Now dynamic topology is pretty new in Blender, but it's really cool because what it allows you to do is, say for example right here, this top face is just the way you want it. You don't want to add more detail or anything. So therefore you wouldn't need to add more geometry to this face because it's already the way you want it to look. But let's say over here you want to add some creases or folds or whatever. If I left click and drag with dynamic topology turned on, you will see that it adds the necessary vertices exactly where you want it without really adding anywhere else. So this way it allows you to add the amount of detail that you want wherever you want and keeping the rest of the mesh with the low amount of detail, and therefore it doesn't use unnecessary vertices and you can add detail and do lots of stuff a lot better because this way you won't have like a million vertices on something where you only need detail in one spot. Now that's dynamic topology. Let's take a look at some of the options for sculpting. The first one is the different brushes that we have. And here are a lot of presets for brushes, which I will go over a little bit later. The next option is the radius, and this determines the size of your brush. And this number is based on pixel size. So if I increase this, you can see that the brush size is bigger. The shortcut key for this is the F key. And if you hit F and drag your mouse, you can make your brush size bigger or smaller. The next option is this right here, this lock. Basically what this does is, if I'm zoomed in like this towards the cube, my brush size is a certain size. But if I start zooming out, you will see that my brush size stays the same, but since I'm zooming out, my cube is getting smaller and smaller. And now my brush size encompasses the whole cube, and this is not necessarily ideal because now I'll be sculpting on the whole cube. So if you enable this, you can see that my brush size is a certain size, and if I zoom out, the brush size will stay relative to the cube. So no matter how far I'm zoomed out, it will be approximately the same size brush strokes. So that's very useful. The next option is the strength, and this determines how strong or how powerful your brush strokes are. So right now, if I draw, you can see that it's at that strength, and if I put this lower, it has a less strength, and right now you can barely see it, but it's still adding geometry. If you look at it from closer, and if I draw, you can see that it's adding the geometry even though it's not protruding as much. But if I put this to 1, you can see that it's a lot more powerful and prominent. So, and then right here, right next to the settings of the radius, strength, and auto smooth, this is for pressure sensitivity. If you're using a tablet, a drawing tablet, if you enable these for the strength, for example, if you press harder, the strength will be stronger, and if you press less, the strength will be less. So these are very useful if you're using a tablet. If you have a tablet, I recommend using it because it's a lot easier to sculpt and a lot faster. But if you don't, a mouse and keyboard is completely fine. Now, the next option is auto smooth, which basically smooths out your brush strokes as you draw. The next one after that is front faces only, which Basically, you can only draw on the faces that are directly facing you and not the ones towards the sides, as the name states. The next one that's important, or that's used a lot, is the add and subtract. So right here, let me put my strength back down to 0.5. And if I left click and drag, you can see that it's adding, it's pulling the mesh upwards. But if I click on subtract, as you guessed, it subtracts the mesh and goes downwards. Now, just like the F and Shift F to control these, the shortcut key for this is if it's set to add and you hit Control, it will inverse it. So instead of adding, it will subtract it. Same thing if you're on subtract, if you hold Control, it will add it instead. So what I like to do is I don't select it here. I just use it. I leave it on add and I draw, and when I need to subtract, I just hit Control and left click, which is a lot faster and easier. Now the next option is texture, which is really cool because this allows you to put in an image texture and basically paint on your mesh how that image texture looks. For example, if you want to put lots of tiny small veins all over your character, and it's very tedious to just draw it one at a time with your strokes like this. So you could add a texture of veins and it will basically be represented as a brush and it will sculpt it the way the image looks. So that's very useful, especially for a very small detail that's tedious to make. The next option is the stroke, and here you have the different methods of how your brush acts. The default one is the space method, and this one basically spaces your brush a certain percent. So right now it's set to 10%, and all the brush strokes are pretty much stuck together and they merge together. If I set this to something higher, like 100%, you can see that when I draw now, it will space it out a lot more. And this is very useful if you want to draw like bumps on the skin of your character. Instead of left clicking one by one, you could just put the spacing up, left click and drag, and just draw all over your character to add warts or bumps instead of doing it one at a time. So that's very useful for that. The next one is drag dot, and this one, as the name implies, allows you to left click and drag a dot around your surface and then let go of your mouse button and it will apply it there. The one after that is dots, which is kind of like an airbrush effect where it is constantly applying the draw brush as long as you're moving your mouse. Next one is anchored, which is kind of cool. It allows you to basically left click and drag out and expand your selection either outwards or inwards, so you could determine exactly how large you want it to be. And the last one is airbrush, which is kind of like dots. I'm not exactly sure what too much the difference. They act a little bit differently, but I usually don't use much of these. I'm usually using the space, which is the default and the most used one. So I'm going to switch it back to that, switch it back to 10%. And now here are a couple other options which I won't go over for the sake of the tutorial, but I encourage you to play around with all the options and figure out exactly what they do. Now the next thing is the curve, and this is really useful because this basically is how your brush is going to look. So right now it's on kind of a smooth curve, so if I draw, you can see that's a pretty smooth stroke. However, if I want it sharper at the, like flatter at the top and sharper on the sides, I can select this one and you can see that now it's flatter at the top and then it starts to smooth out towards the sides. You can also, here there's a couple of presets, but you can also move around the points and add points to make your own curves and have your brush act exactly how you want it to. For now, I'm just going to put it back to this. The next option is in the topology tab, is the enable dynamic topology, which is what we went over when we started adding all this geometry. Now, one thing to note is if you go out of sculpt mode and into object mode and then back to sculpt mode, you will see that dynamic topology is no longer on. So you have to enable it back. And also, I think when you go into edit mode, it also goes off. So just make sure that if you go into into another mode or edit mode or anything, to re-enable it, or else you won't be using dynamic topology. Now right here, the detail size, this is very important because like it says, this is the size of the detail, or the size of the length of the edges. So right now by default it's set to 30, which is a good number to start with. So usually what you would do is start with 30 and draw in all your rough forms and bigger detail onto your character or whatever you're sculpting. Now keep in mind that the detail size is based on pixels. So if I'm zoomed out like this, it will draw it at a certain size, and if I zoom in way close, it will make the edge lengths a lot smaller because it's based on pixels. Now what you usually want to do is with detail size of 30, just stay approximately the same amount of zoomed in as you would around the whole mesh. Don't like start drawing like this and then zoom in really close for small detail, because for smaller detail you would do something else. So for size 30, you would go around your whole mesh and basically block it out and put the larger detail. Then what you would do is go down 10, so you would go to size 20 and then start putting in the medium detail. And then after that you would go to size 10 and put in detail like wrinkles and things like that, because it has a lot smaller detail size. Now what you want to keep in mind also is that with the detail size, the lower you go, the more geometry it will add. As you can see with detail size, it adds a lot of geometry. So you only want to use this if you have to. So just play around with your mesh, and if you see that you need more detail and more geometry to play with, just put the detail size lower. Next thing is smooth shading, and this, what it does is it makes the shading of your object look smoother basically. So it's not all blocky and sharp edges. Right here, collapse short edges is a really cool feature, because what this allows you to do is, for example, right here I drew this very fine detail with detail size 10, and let's say that I want to put this back to detail size 30, and I want to get rid of this sort of, or just draw a bigger detail size over this, and I don't need all this geometry. Without this selected, if I draw on it, you will see that it adds it underneath it, and there's still this small detail size right here, which is annoying because I don't want that anymore. So if I enable collapse short edges, what it will do is it will basically collapse and merge all the edges that are shorter or smaller than size 30. So since this is size 10, if I draw on this now, you will see that it completely disappears and they were all merged together, and now they're not on top of this. So this is really useful if you want to get rid of small detail or things like that. Now the next option right here is symmetrize, and this is really useful because, for example, if you're right here and you drew some things on this side of the mesh, for example, and you know that the other side of the mesh is going to be exactly the same, such as a human or a dog or pretty much any character, usually it's symmetrical on both sides, and then you realize that you didn't do it on this side the same, then right here you could select a direction for it to symmetrize from. So right now it's selected from -x to x, so it will copy this side to this side. So what I want is to copy this right here that I just drew to this side. So I would select +x, which is this way, as you can see from the red axis right here. This is positive x, so I want to copy positive x to negative x. So I select that and I hit symmetrize, and you can see that it copies both of those sides exactly. So that's very useful if you forgot and you need to have both sides the same. The next option is down here. Right here, you could lock the axes. So basically, when you draw, if you draw it and you don't want it to draw upwards on the z-axis, you could lock that axis. So now if you draw it, you can see that not much is happening because it's not allowed to go up on the z-axis. If I lock it on the x-axis, you can see that I could draw here, but if I go on the x-axis, not much happens because it's constrained. So I'm going to deselect that. Next option is threaded sculpt, and this is basically if you have multiple CPUs to use those so it goes faster. Right here, fast navigate, this is used for multi-res, so it doesn't really work with dynamic topology. Show brush, just as the name implies, it shows or hides the brush. And then over here, this is pretty useful, the size and the strength. These are the unified settings, because over here on the brushes, you have the size and the strength. But right now I'm on brush, and if you look at the size and strength, if I go and select something else like clay, or grab, or flatten, or anything else, you could see that the size or the strength right now is changing. If I select it, however, it means that the size and the strength, since both of them are selected, are going to be the same on every brush. So it depends whether you want to change the size and strength on every brush or if you want to keep it the same size and strength throughout all the brushes. I find that keeping it the same is sometimes better, and then sometimes it's better to keep it different. It's all up to how your workflow is. So for now I'm just going to deselect those, and the next thing is symmetry. Now this is very useful also. It's kind of like the symmetrize right here, but this one, if you enable it, for example, if I enable mirror X, it will mirror it as I draw. So right here, it will symmetrize and mirror exactly what I draw on this side. So if you have a human or any character, like I said before, and you want it to be the same on both sides, you could hit mirror X and it will copy it to both sides. However, this one over here, the symmetrize option, is useful because sometimes you don't want to be drawing on both sides because it could slow your computer down if you're drawing on both sides and you're adding geometry on both sides. Sometimes you want to only be drawing or doing the sculpting on one side, and then when you like it, hit the symmetrize so that you only have half the amount of vertices and it won't slow down your computer as much. Now you could also mirror it on the Y, Z, all of them if you want. So now if I draw it, it mirrors it pretty much throughout. And the last thing is the appearance. What this does is basically the color of your circle. So right here, it's red. I could change that if I want. It's all up to you, but for now I'm going to leave it at the default red-ish color.